So climate change. The American public's understanding of climate change is notoriously dismal. A recent survey by the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication found that although the majority of Americans think that climate change is happening, since I prepared this slide, they had a new survey and we're up to about 70% of the American public acknowledging that the reality of climate change. Only about half think that it is due to human activities, while a third think, on the other hand, that it is due to natural causes. And that data is pretty much unchanged in the new survey. Moreover, that same survey indicated that only about 1 in 10 Americans are aware of the overwhelming scientific consensus on climate change, which includes both its reality and the role of human activity in producing it. Given those facts, it might seem obvious that the solution to this sad state of affairs is to do a better job of educating the public about climate change. And the ubiquity and rigor of formal education suggests that the best place to engage the widest possible audience in learning about climate change is the public school science classroom. Everybody goes to public school, everybody studies science there, give or take a few people. But, as obvious as that might seem, doubt and denial about climate change present challenges to doing so, serious challenges. What do I mean by doubt and denial about climate change? Well, we need to know what's being doubted and denied. That is, the scientific consensus on climate change. So let me take a moment just to say what that is and what it's based on. For my purposes tonight, there are just 4 basic points I want to make. The first is that over the past 150 years, climate around the globe has changed rapidly and significantly. The graph you see here pulls together a dozen or so sources of data and ways of assessing temperature in the northern hemisphere over the past 1,000 years or so, and you can see that there's a spike right there at the end. There are other sources of data, there are other ways of assessing temperature, but the lines of evidence all converge on one conclusion, one basic fact: it's getting warmer overall. That, of course, does not mean that it's getting warmer everywhere. The climate system is complex, and a global increase in warming can result in it being cooler in some places and at some times than otherwise. But overall, it's getting warmer. The second point, the recent climate change is due mainly to human activity, primarily, though not exclusively, the burning of fossil fuels. We know a lot about what drives climate on Earth, mainly the sun, but there are other factors, from continental drift and changes in the shape of the Earth's orbit, to variations in the sun's activity and phenomena like El Niño. These can all influence the climate, and that's what enables us to tease out the contribution of human activity. For example, in the graph you see here, the top line is the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and the bottom line is the level of human carbon dioxide emissions. Note that they have the same shape. Here, too, there are other sources of data and other ways of assessing them, but here, too, the lines of evidence all converge on the same basic fact: we're making it get warmer. The third point, climate change is already affecting the planet and society and will continue to do so for generations. For example, it's not a good time to be living on a low-lying island. Sea levels are rising due to ice melting at the poles, and storms are getting worse because there's more water and more energy circling around in the atmosphere. The folks you see here lived on the Carteret Islands in the South Pacific. Used to live. They have begun to evacuate those islands due to worsening storms and tides and increasing sea levels. Also, increased atmospheric carbon dioxide is making water more acidic, which hurts marine ecosystems. On land, storms will be getting worse too, and freshwater resources will be affected, with winter snowpack and mountain glaciers declining. I come to you from California, where we've had drought for years and years, and the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada is not adequate for the state's needs. Not all these changes are necessarily bad. New areas will be opening up for farming in the far northern hemisphere, for example. But change is disruptive, so it's good to understand the change if you want to deal with the disruptions. And the fourth point, it's possible to take steps to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. Mitigation means limiting the amount of climate change which occurs, Primarily, that's going to be by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, while adaptation means changing the way we as a society live in response to our changing climate. I'm not going to go into various proposals for mitigation and adaptation. That's not the goal here today. But I do want to make a broader point about it. Science of itself doesn't tell us what we ought to do to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. Making such decision requires setting priorities and balancing competing concerns, and that's something that science doesn't do. But it can tell us what the costs and benefits of any decision are likely to be, and without that knowledge, we can't hope to make a good decision. I said that these 4 points were part of the scientific consensus, and they are in fact scientifically uncontroversial. To show this, consider a paper called Expert Credibility in Climate Change, which is a 2010 paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The authors examined papers published by 1,372 climate scientists and found that 97 to 98% of the most published and most cited researchers in climate science had endorsed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change statement of 2001, which makes basically those 4 points, while only 2 to 3% of those most prominent researchers had dissented from that consensus. Other estimates of the degree of scientific consensus of climate change have used different methods to ascertain the extent of the scientific consensus, and they all converge on the same numbers, upwards of 97% of climate researchers agreeing on these points. So let's see now. If you've got a solid scientific consensus on a particular topic in science, as you do with climate change, and it's an area of science that's really important for people to understand, as climate change is, then why and how would you argue against its being taught as such in the classrooms of our public schools? Well, as for why, like evolution denial, which I'm talking about tomorrow, by the way, climate change denial is essentially driven by extra scientific considerations from without science. For evolution deniers, the song is familiar. Accepting evolution leads to a loss of faith, a demoralization of society, human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. That's Ghostbusters, yeah. For climate change deniers, it's the same tune in a different key. It's an economic rather than a religious ideology at stake. Indeed, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway have argued in their Merchants of Doubt, a fine book, that climate change denial is rooted in something they call free market fundamentalism, much as creationism is rooted in religious fundamentalism. The ideological polarization of climate change in the United States is by now abundantly clear. Take a look at this chart showing the divergence between Democratic and Republican acceptance of climate change.
Just climate change existing, or that man is the major emphasis?
Thanks. This is climate change existing without a...
Why?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Now, local school boards are usually, and state boards of education are often, filled by electoral contest and partisan elections. So it's hard to avoid the influence of partisan politics on climate change education in the United States. So that's the why. Climate change denial is driven by ideology. And what's the how? It's helpful to think about the rhetoric of climate change denial as resting on 3 pillars. The first pillar of climate change denial is aimed at the science, involving a straightforward denial of the scientific consensus on climate change. Since that consensus, as we've seen, involves 4 central points, there's obviously room for several ways in which the consensus could be denied. The idea that a cold snap could prove scientists wrong is pretty rare, notwithstanding cartoonists looking for cheap irony. The most common forms of climate change denial are denial that significant climate change is occurring at all, and acknowledgement that significant climate change is occurring, combined with denial that human activity is significantly responsible for it. Now, you might be wondering, just how do you reject the scientific consensus and hope to be taken seriously? It wouldn't work with the shape of the Earth, presumably. So there are 3 main tactics here. There's denying that there's a consensus. Attacks on the existence of the consensus are often supported by providing a petition signed by a bunch of people, or by citing a handful of distinguished scientists who deny climate change. But of course, consensus is not unanimity, so this is far from convincing. Likewise, such attacks are often supported by the citation of unanswered questions of data and theory in climate science. After all, climate science isn't 100% certain, as everyone can agree, and as this cartoon admonishes us. But of course, such is the normal state of any vibrant area of science. That's why scientists get up in the morning to try to answer the unsolved questions. And the existence of unsolved questions in climate science notwithstanding, the existence of a genuine and robust consensus among climate scientists on the basic points of climate change are quite clear. The second tactic is acknowledging that there's a consensus, but denying that the evidence on which it's based is genuine. Attacks on the legitimacy of the evidence sometimes allege that it is fraudulent or the product of a conspiracy. You might not have been able to see it in the last cartoon, but after the man watching television shouts, "Aha, I knew it," a little character on the edge of the cartoon comments, "It follows that it's all a hoax." Of course, these claims are sensationalistic and indeed absurd. Outright fraud is rare in science, and the idea of fraud on such a scale as that would be necessary to account for the scientific community's consensus on climate change is ridiculous. So the idea that the consensus on climate change is all the product of a fraud or hoax is kind of absurd. It gets the more absurd the more you look into it. Claims that the evidence on which the consensus is not fraudulent or a hoax, but is nevertheless systematically mistaken, requires some explanation, and an explanation that has not been forthcoming. And the third tactic here is acknowledging that there is a consensus, and acknowledging that the evidence on which it is based is legitimate evidence, but denying that the evidence supports the consensus, saying, that is, that there are other interpretations. But of course, the claim that there's a valid interpretation of the same evidence is a claim that is properly part of climate science. If you really thought that there was an alternative explanation, scientific explanation for all this evidence, then you should be making the case to the community of relevant scientific experts, something that climate change deniers are loath to do. And if you can't convince the experts you're right, why should you be allowed to tell defenseless students that you're right? So that's the first pillar of climate change denial, as I've characterized it. The second is the idea that acceptance of climate science, and climate change in particular, is driven by radical ideological motivations and leads to undesirable social consequences, such as the Unabomber, who you see on a billboard here. His manifesto wasn't, in fact, all that concerned about climate change, but never mind that. This is a billboard that the climate change denial think tank, the Heartland Institute, put up in Chicago a while back. It lost them donors. So the folks at Heartland and other climate change deniers often interpret climate science in general and climate change education in particular as ideologically based and economically motivated, aimed at endorsing particular policies in response to climate change, benefiting particular sectors of society or industry at the expense of others, or even as attacking the ideas of capitalism, the free market, and national sovereignty, favoring the ideas of socialism, collective ownership, world government, or in the most extreme cases, neo-pagan nature worship. I am not, as Dave Barry likes to say, making this up. Of course, the thing is, these claims are themselves typically based on economic and political concerns. It's not without significance that the main funders of climate change denial efforts have been historically from the extraction industries, such as gasoline and coal producers, precisely the areas of industry that stand to lose the most from carbon controls. It isn't only about the source of the money, of course. These claims resonate with a particular set of political views, and there's a strong, widely reported, and extensively researched correlation between political conservatism and climate change denial in the United States, as we saw in the slide before. And it's important to note that acceptance of climate change is not inexorably linked to any political ideology or economic interest. There are conservatives who accept climate change. Such conservatives even include leading climate change scientists such as Carrie Emanuel, described by the LA Times as a politically conservative climatologist who accepts the broad consensus on global warming. Big business accepts climate change. Consider the United States Climate Action Partnership, in which major companies such as Alcoa, Chrysler, and General Electric have joined leading environmental groups in lobbying for climate legislation. Insurance companies are particularly concerned because they're going to be on the hook. The United States Armed Forces and national security agencies accept climate change. In 2010, for example, the Department of Defense acknowledged the need to adjust to the impacts of climate change on our facilities and military capabilities, adding that climate change may add as an accelerant of instability or conflict around the world, a good prophecy. The Department of Homeland Security similarly concluded that climate change has the potential to accelerate and intensify extreme weather events which threaten the nation's stability and security. And my illustration here, these are Marines inspecting solar panels deployed at a forward operating base. And I find it hard to believe that the Corps, of all people, is in the grips of neo-pagan nature worship. The third pillar of climate change denial is that it's only fair to acknowledge a scientific controversy over climate change. This is perhaps the most insidious of the lot. It takes the first pillar for granted, assuming, falsely, that there is a legitimate scientific controversy over climate change. But it's rhetorically powerful because of its appeal to ideals of fair play and even dealing that are, deservedly, popular among the American public. So popular that they are easy to abuse in the service of climate change denial. But you know, there's a quite wonderful store on the web that offers t-shirts highlighting a variety of controversies. Whether aliens built the pyramids, whether storks bring babies, whether the royal family of England are extraterrestrial reptiles, whether the moon landing was a hoax, whether perpetual motion is possible, whether the earth is flat, and many more besides. Each t-shirt, as you see, implores us to teach the controversy. Should these controversies be taught? As a rule, you don't find people calling for teaching the controversy across the board for every subject, otherwise you'd see more of these ideas in schools. Rather, you find them doing so only when they have their own agenda on a particular subject, only when it's their ox being gored, or perhaps vice versa. The fact is, scientists are in broad agreement about the occurrences, causes, and consequences of climate change. Climate change deniers are wrong to claim otherwise. And science teachers thus have a responsibility to help their teachers understand climate change, the evidence for climate change, and the fact of the scientific consensus on climate change. Presenting climate change as scientifically controversial, or misrepresenting the scientific consensus on climate change, is anything but fair. It's unfair to the scientists on whose research the consensus is based. It's unfair to the authors of textbooks and the framers of state science standards who have labored to present the consensus in a pedagogically appropriate manner. Unfair to the science educators asked to ignore their professional responsibility to present the best science. Unfair to the taxpayers who are entitled to expect public science education and public policy to respect the consensus of the scientific community. And most of all, of course, unfair to the students whose scientific literacy is on the line in a rapidly warming world. In fact, what's truly unfair is not to teach the scientific consensus on climate change. So, how are doubt and denial about climate change affecting science education? In two ways. They engender challenges to teaching climate change by derailing, delaying, or degrading attempts to include it or improve it in science education, and challenges in teaching climate change by influencing teachers to present climate change in a way that compromises the scientific accuracy and pedagogical effectiveness of their lessons. So first, let me say something about challenges to teaching climate change. I note that, independently of doubt and denial, climate change is already hard to teach. The topic is inherently interdisciplinary, with no obvious place in the standard high school science curriculum, where it's common for college-bound students to be marched through a biology, chemistry, physics sequence. This is a neglect endemic to cartoonists too, as you see. According to a recent study, only 2 states require a year-long earth or environmental science course for graduation from high school, only 2, while 30 require a year-long life science course and 20 require a year-long physical science course. And naturally, it's in an earth science class or an environmental science class that's easiest to address climate change. It's also true that the science of climate change is relatively new, starting in the late 19th century, but only really getting going in the 1960s. So many teachers will not have received formal training in it. Many textbooks will not include it or not be up to date on it. Many states will not include it in their science standards. One study, and this is a page from it, showed that as of 2005, only 30 states mentioned anything at all about anthropogenic climate change. Only 17 called for teaching anything about the mechanism of climate change. Only 7 actually implied that the burning of fossil fuels contributes to climate change. That's of 2005. Since 2005, state science standards are increasingly including or improving their treatment of climate change. But there's evidence that doubt and denial are standing in the way of those efforts. In the past few years, state legislators have attempted to block the adoption or implementation of new sets of state science standards in Idaho, Iowa, Michigan, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Wyoming, owing largely to their treatment of climate change. And as if they didn't have it bad enough, West Virginia, the State Board of Education got into the act and tampered with the science standards to weaken the treatment of climate change. The legislative attacks are sometimes really very blatant. In 2010, South Dakota's legislature adopted House Concurrent Resolution 1009. The resolution described climate change as a scientific theory rather than a proven fact, and cited purported evidence against global warming. And this is a skeptics group, so you will like this. An early version of the bill referred to, quote, a variety of climatological, meteorological, astrological, thermological, cosmological, and ecological dynamics. Astrological dynamics. As if glaciers melt slower when the moon is in the 3rd house of Sagittarius. This did not inspire a lot of confidence in the scientific competence of the legislature. The resolution also suggested that the scientific consensus on climate change was due to political and philosophical viewpoints, which has complicated and prejudiced the scientific investigation of global warming phenomena. There's your second pillar of climate science denial. And called for balanced teaching of global warming in the public schools of South Dakota. There's your third pillar. As a resolution, HCR 1009 was non-binding, merely expressing the legislature's view and not requiring teachers in South Dakota to teach any differently, but it surely sent a message to those teachers. And 2 states, Tennessee and Louisiana, have binding, although less explicit, anti-climate change education laws on their books. Doubt and denial are also standing in the way of updating textbooks to include climate change. In Texas, for example, social studies textbooks under consideration in 2014 were found to misrepresent climate change as scientifically controversial. One even quoted a climate change denial organization. You probably can't read this, but this is a handout produced for use with one of the textbooks, which gives students a set of parallel claims that state or reject the scientific consensus on climate change as though they were of equal scientific credibility. Fortunately, despite intensive lobbying from the bad guys, the publishers revised their textbooks to remove these misrepresentations, and the State Board of Education voted to adopt the textbooks nevertheless.
I understand the implication. Texas drives textbooks for everywhere else.
Yes, indeed. What happens in Texas doesn't stay in Texas. Now, both science standards and textbooks matter, of course. Science standards, as guidelines indicating what knowledge and ability students are expected to have at various points in their education, are triply important to curriculum and instruction. They dictate the content of textbooks, they provide the basis for high-stakes statewide testing, they supply the framework on which local teachers base their curricula. And textbooks, of course, often serve as the main source of scientific information for teachers and their districts in determining what is, in fact, taught in the classroom. Go back. But at the end of the day, science standards and textbooks, regardless of their quality, provide only guidance to teachers. Here we have some teachers. If teachers are not sufficiently prepared, confident, or willing to teach climate change in accordance with the scientific consensus, then they're not going to do so, regardless of what the textbooks say, regardless of what the state standards say. So the question naturally arises, how are teachers nationally presenting climate change? Are they presenting the scientific consensus on climate change accurately without compromise? Or are doubt and denial standing in the way of their doing so? Until recently, there were only 3 substantial studies that addressed such questions, conducted by the National Science Teachers Association, the National Earth Science Teachers Association, and a biologist named Sarah Wise in Colorado. And just to summarize the relevant results, all of these surveys found that it was common for science teachers to feel uncomfortable teaching climate change. This discomfort was manifested in their avoiding the topic, presenting alternatives to the scientific consensus, with quotation marks around alternatives, or misrepresenting the scientific consensus as, in fact, scientifically controversial. The problem with these surveys is the first 2 of them involved self-selected respondents, or selected for convenience, and they had relatively meager questionnaires, while Sarah Wise's study, avoiding those problems, was nonetheless restricted to a single state, Colorado. So those studies failed to tell the whole story of how teachers are presenting climate change in the classroom. Consequently, the National Center for Science Education, where I work, ncsc.com, not org, together with researchers at Penn State, undertook a nationally representative survey of science teachers focused on climate change. So in the NCSC Penn State survey, data from 1,500 science teachers hailing from public, middle, and high schools in all 50 states were collected using state-of-the-art methods and survey research. I'm not a survey researcher, so don't ask me what those are. The detail that really stuck out is they gave all of them a $2 bill on the idea that it attracts their attention and makes them feel indebted. So a detailed questionnaire was used in the survey to collect information from the respondents, not only about the topics and methods they used in teaching climate change, but also about all kinds of things: their personal views about climate change, their pre-service and in-service training, and their personal background, including their ethnicity, their religion, and their politics. As the title of the top-line report suggests, mixed messages, there was good news and there was bad news. So here's the good news. Most of the science teachers were presenting climate change to their students. 3 out of 4 reported devoting at least 1 hour to doing so, with the mean being about 4 hours among those covering the topic. The teachers reported discussing topics central to understanding climate change, such as the greenhouse effect and the carbon cycle. They also discussed observable consequences of climate change and potential ways of mitigating and adapting to climate change. And we also asked about what their colleagues were teaching, and putting one thing together with another, we think that 98% of public high schools are teaching about recent global warming in at least one class. And as for doubt and denial, there was further good news. Now, doubt and denial, we know from anecdote and impression, have certainly been at the root of attempts to undermine the teaching of climate science in the classroom. For example, in Los Alamitos, California, in 2011, the district adopted a policy requiring teachers requiring any controversial issue to use material that offers a balance of viewpoints and encourages students to examine each side of the issue. That might sound innocuous on its face. If the issue is controversial, then shouldn't students receive a balanced presentation and be expected to examine all sides of it? A moment's thought, of course, will reveal that this is a classic appeal to the third pillar of climate change denial, and one wants to know who decides whether an issue is really controversial and what a balanced presentation will consist in. And indeed, it turns out that the policy in Los Alamitos was adopted at the behest of a district trustee who was concerned about the Advanced Placement Environmental Science program, which addressed climate change. So, interviewed by the local newspaper, he explained, there are 2 clearly divergent opinions on global warming. There are those who believe that global warming is a fact created by man's impact on the environment and the consequences will be devastating. There are others on the conservative side who believe it's much ado about nothing. It's overhyped and politically motivated, and the science is not solid, and there's room for more studies. On this particular issue, I'm not pushing my view. I just want the kids to be presented with balance. He couldn't have done a better job articulating the 3 pillars if he tried to do so. The adoption of the policy in Los Alamitos provoked a controversy in the district, even attracting international attention. Fortunately, thanks to the action of concerned parents and teachers, the policy was revised with some input from NCSC. Instead of requiring teachers to present each side of the issue, regardless of its scientific merit, The new policy instructs teachers to represent facts and concepts of controversial issues from multiple perspectives to ensure that students develop critical thinking and problem-solving skills. That's in educationese, so I'm not quite sure what it means. But the teachers in the district regarded the revised policy as no longer requiring them to compromise the integrity of science education, so they were happy, so we were happy. Further good news. So here it is. That kind of pressure that we saw in Los Alamitos is relatively uncommon. Only 4.4% of teachers in the survey reported experiencing overt pressure not to teach about climate change. That compares quite favorably with the 22% of teachers reporting overt pressure not to teach about evolution in a comparable survey with some of the same researchers. That pressure came from parents, 1.9% of respondents, local religious or community leaders and fellow teachers, 1.5% for both, school administrators, less than 1%, school board members, less than 1%. So we can all go home now, right? No. Okay, so here comes the bad news. There was bad news, and a lot of it involves the effect of doubt and denial. The respondents were asked, when they teach about climate change, whether they emphasize the scientific consensus that recent global warming is primarily being caused by human release of greenhouse gases from fossil fuels, and whether they emphasize that many scientists believe, on the other hand, that recent increases in temperature are likely due to natural causes. About 64% of respondents emphasized the scientific consensus, yay, while about 66% emphasized the alternative, boo. But moreover, about 30% of scientific teachers emphasized both, presenting a contradictory message about the scientific consensus on climate change. Yeah, most scientists believe this, but a whole lot of them don't. So what kind of message does that give? So where does that come from? Well, part of the reason may be the lack of knowledge on the part of science teachers about the scientific consensus. So we asked the teachers, what proportion of climate scientists think that global warming is caused mostly by human activities? And asked them to pick a quintile, a 20% range. Only 30% selected the correct quintile, 81 to 100%. Well, now you know. I mean, it's understandable, if unfortunate, that teachers who are unaware of the existence of a scientific consensus on climate change present alternatives to it as though they were scientifically credible. Doubt and denial also seem to affect the teacher's choice of pedagogical techniques. So in one question in the survey, respondents were asked whether they encourage students to debate the likely causes of global warming and whether they encourage students to come to their own conclusions about the causes of global warming. Debate, think for yourself. About 58% of respondents encouraged debate. About 60% encouraged students to come to their own conclusions. Now, both of these techniques are likely to promote doubt and denial among their students. After all, we don't encourage students to debate the likely causes of osmosis. We don't ask them to come to their own conclusions about the causes of photosynthesis. These are inappropriate techniques to use in the classroom with regard to well-established scientific principles. In a separate question, 9 different strategies for addressing the controversial nature of climate change, and here I mean the socially controversial nature, were presented to the teachers. And we asked them, have you used these techniques? Might you use them if you saw occasion to, or would you not use them? Now, not all of these strategies are likely to promote a doubt or denial. Discussing the controversy in the context of the nature of science, adhering strictly to standards and not allowing discussion that might become controversial, discouraging debate because I believe that most skepticism is not based on sound science. These are not techniques that are going to promote doubt and denial among the students. But 27% of the teachers said that they had given equal time to perspectives that raised doubt that humans are causing climate change. 48% said that they haven't, but they might. 47% of respondents said that they had allowed students to discuss the controversy without the teacher taking a stand. 38% said that they hadn't, but they might do so. 6% of respondents said that they had allowed students to opt out of that part of the class. 27% said that they might do so. And these are all, again, techniques that are likely to cause doubt and denial about climate change in the students. So why do teachers make that kind of decision? Well, we looked into that. Choices of pedagogical techniques, we think, are influenced by the attitudes of the teachers toward the science. That's not surprising. And when we ask them to express a preference among global warming is caused mostly by human activities, global warming is caused mostly by natural changes in the environment, and global warming is not happening, we found 68% of respondents preferred the first, 16% preferred the second, about 2% preferred the third. Interestingly, about 12% volunteered that global warming is caused mostly by both human activities and natural changes. So, if, as the survey results indicate, doubt and denial affect the teaching of climate change, it might be tempting to assume that the solution to the problem is just to inform teachers about the scientific consensus, and then they can take that off to the students and all will be sweetness and light. Well, you know, the survey did suggest that the amount of training teachers had about climate change is really important. Teachers who had taken college or continuing education classes about climate change were more likely to emphasize the scientific consensus, less likely to present alternatives to it as scientifically credible. There's clearly room for improvement on the score, too. Less than half of the teachers answering the survey said that they had ever taken a course in college that devoted even a single class session to climate change. And it's a really encouraging sign that 2 out of 3 teachers said that they would take a continuing education class on climate science if one were available to them. Importantly, though, you'd have to give them somewhere to do that teaching, and it will be necessary to raise the curricular profile of classes where it's natural to teach climate change, earth sciences, ocean sciences, atmospheric sciences, environmental sciences, and the like. Failing that, biology is probably best. So yeah, you can educate the teachers more, and there's a lot of work that can be done. But it's not realistic to suppose that this is sufficient. Because remember, we also asked the teachers about their personal beliefs, about their religion and their politics. And it was important. Teachers who regarded the Bible as the literal word of God, and teachers who identified themselves as Republicans, were less likely to emphasize the scientific consensus on climate change, more likely to present alternatives as scientifically credible. So take a look at this graph which we ran up for the report. This plots the political views of the teachers, from liberal on the left side of the x-axis to conservative on the right, against their estimates of the scientific consensus on climate change on the y-axis. The distance between their estimates and the actual 97 level, that's the red dotted line at the top, represents a consensus gap. Some of that gap you might ascribe to lack of knowledge, represented here in blue, because even the liberal teachers have that gap. But some of that gap seems to be due to political ideologies affecting teachers, and that's represented here in red.
Where are these teachers?
All over. There are 1,500 teachers all over the country in each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. Well, gosh, that's interesting. What do you do about that? It's neither desirable nor indeed possible to try to change the religious and political views of individual teachers. You can't do it, and you probably shouldn't do it even if you could. But, you know, you can talk to them. And citing prominent climate scientists who share such beliefs, yet accept the science, such as the evangelical Katharine Hayhoe or the Republican Kerry Emanuel, and using resources from organizations that endorse such beliefs and yet accept the science, such as the Evangelical Climate Initiative and Republican, conservative and concerned about climate change, you're not alone, is its slogan. These are resources that might be helpful in getting them to reconcile to the scientific consensus. How about politics? Well, the attitudes toward climate science in the communities of the teachers was also important. Indeed, teachers in states with a lower degree of acceptance of climate change, this is their states, were less likely to emphasize the scientific consensus and more likely to use pedagogical strategies that promote doubt and denial among their students or avoid the topics altogether. Even controlling, right, for their personal political and religious beliefs, their communities make a difference. And these effects were also visible at the county level because we had data for counties, because we had good data. So this figure here shows that regardless of a teacher's personal political views, he or she is likely to perceive a higher scientific consensus on climate change if he happens to be in a Democratic rather than a Republican county. Your context matters. These teachers apparently take their cues from their communities, or at any rate from their understanding of their communities, because there's some reason to think that people overestimate the conservativeness of their communities. Different research. So the importance of community attitudes toward climate change suggests that to the extent that teachers believe that their community accepts the scientific consensus on climate change, they'll feel more comfortable in teaching that consensus in their classrooms, which is not surprising, but it's nice to have the data to back it up. What do you do about that? Well, gosh, the task of informing local communities about the scientific consensus on climate change and convincing them of its reliability is monumental. And how best to accomplish it is at best contentious. But it's something that teachers, at any rate, can see the value of, as well as do their bit to contribute to. So, eventually, we hope, textbooks, state science standards, pre-service and in-service teacher training, local communities will all come to reflect and fully accept the scientific consensus on climate change. It will then be, if not easy, at least easier, for science teachers to present climate change accurately and effectively in their classrooms, and thus to equip their students with the scientific wherewithal to cope with the challenges of a warming world. Apropos, this illustration is the frontispiece to the first edition of Thomas More's book, Utopia. So until that happy day arrives, and I don't see it coming too soon, there are some recommendations that NCSE likes to offer to science teachers for coping with doubt and denial in the classroom. The first is that teaching climate change effectively tends of itself to diffuse doubt and denial. If you're teaching it right, it's less likely that students will be worried about it. So in the first place, science teachers should not only understand the basic principles of climate science as the scientific community understands them, but also take care to use the most effective pedagogical methods for presenting them. There are prevalent misconceptions, for example, that students are likely to have about the climate system, which teachers need to understand, be able to identify in their students, and take measures to counteract. So I'm putting in a little plug for my former colleague Mark McCaffrey's book, Climate Smart and Energy Wise, if any of you happen to be science teachers. It's also important to avoid disheartening or depressing students while discussing the impacts of climate change. That would be the slide on the left, obviously. And the solution is to help them appreciate that the fourth basic point of climate science, that humans can take action to mitigate and adapt to climate change. It's crucial, of course, to do so in such a way that acknowledges that science, although important, is not capable of determining the proper response to climate change. Such a suggestion would not only mischaracterize the nature of science, a bad thing in itself, but also might open the teacher to the charge of imposing his or her own values in the science classroom. And we actually get a fair number of reports of teachers who are accused of doing so by teaching climate change. It is inappropriate for teachers to impose their own values on their students, so we advise them not to. Science teachers should also be familiar, at least in broad outlines, with the claim of climate change deniers and their flaws. Skepticalscience.com is a valuable resource, and it's a lot of fun to read even if you're not a teacher. Teachers should be ready to cite the consensus of the scientific community on the reality and causes of climate change, and the consensus of the science education community on the importance of climate change education. They need to be respectful of student concerns, which often come from trusted authority sources, trusted by the students, that is, should those concerns arise in class, but they shouldn't really be willing to engage them, or their sources, in fruitless debate. And of course, science teachers should not misrepresent the scientific consensus by suggesting that climate change is a matter of scientific controversy, or by presenting the other side as though we're scientifically credible. They shouldn't conduct debates in classes about whether science change is happening. This clip is from, as I think you recognize, is from Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, where for once, they had a statistically representative debate on climate change. That's 97 scientists with data and 3 doubters. And teachers should not use supplementary materials that misrepresent climate science or invite guest speakers in to misrepresent climate science. Here are some of the materials in wide circulation. The one on the left, Climate Change Reconsidered, is from the Heartland Institute, which commissioned that Unabomber billboard I showed you earlier. The one in the middle there, bottom middle there, Unstoppable Solar Cycles, is from an outfit called Is It? I'm in town this week because I was running NCSE's booth at the NEA convention at the big convention center in Mount Vernon. And I saw that Is It was there, so I went over and said, I'm not a teacher, but I'm an exhibitor. I'm really interested in your materials. All true so far. Do you have anything on climate change? It turned out they hadn't brought Unstoppable Solar Cycles, but they were willing to recommend it. So, and they were handing out a lot of free stuff. So, one more piece of advice for teachers or those who love them: discussing climate change denial as a social controversy, as opposed to a scientific controversy, is not necessarily inappropriate. It might be useful for the right teacher with the right group of students. But here, again, it's important not to discuss it in a way that hinders student understanding of the science, or by misrepresenting the scientific consensus on climate change. After all, misrepresenting a socially controversial scientific topic as scientifically controversial is committing the deadliest sin in science education, screwing up the science. The United States is unusual, although not unique, in the developed world for its high level of rejection of climate change, owing to a combination of powerful corporate interests and increasing ideological partisanship. So in this graph here, lighter is worse. There aren't any studies in countries outside the United States comparable to the NCSE Penn State study. It seems altogether too likely, though, that the United States is also unique in the developed world for the high degree to which doubt and denial present challenges to and in teaching climate change. These are formidable challenges, and it's clear that there's neither a simple nor a single way of overcoming them. The National Center for Science Education, for which I work, is involved in a variety of efforts to overcome such challenges, both to climate change education and to evolution education. So what do we do at NCSE when we don't get to talk to good folks like you? Well, our primary role is to provide assistance, support, and advice to teachers, parents, concerned citizens in general who are facing ideological attacks on science education in their local communities or in their states. So NCSE is, we like to say, a sort of crisis clinic. That's the office there. But in addition to helping people in the middle of their crises over climate change or evolution education, we're also involved in various larger scale efforts, such as that NCSE Penn State survey of climate change education. The wealth of data that provided us about what teachers are teaching about climate change and how is going to inform a lot of efforts, and not only NCSE's efforts, at improving climate change education in the future. In the long run, few of the challenges to teaching climate change seem likely to be successful, while few of the challenges in teaching climate change seem likely to be insuperable. I think we can get over this. And perhaps the most encouraging reason for hope in a brighter future for climate change education in the United States is that there really is support out there for it. These data are from a 2001 survey of adults and teens, and you find that large majorities think that schools should teach our children about the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to global warming, and that the government should be involved in that. There are in fact, bills in Congress right now, one in the Senate and a counterpart one in the House, that would direct NOAA to do so. People agree that climate change education is important. They want it. But of course, to get it, we'll have to surmount doubt and denial. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I wanted to make sure I understood NCSE's view in terms of educating students about climate change, and is it separately or not even touched on in terms of, here are some options in terms of mitigation and adaptation and so forth, or is that sort of left to the side?
We think it's a good idea for students to be taught about various possibilities for mitigation and adaptation. First, because it's scientifically important. Second, because it's relevant to understanding what the future is going to be like, and also because it helps alleviate any kind of depression that students may sink into at facing the prospect.
Nuclear power, fission considered in that?
But we don't go into specifics but we don't do the nuts and bolts of curriculum. So it might be, it might not be. It depends on the needs of the teacher, the school district, et cetera. Yes, ma'am.
Those 2 to 3% scientists who do they deny climate change, or do they deny that it's caused by humans?
So they vary. Some of them will deny warming altogether. Some will deny humans as the cause. I don't know of a breakdown offhand. I'm sorry?
Do you know the affiliation of these? For example, do they teach at Liberty University, or do they work for ExxonMobil? I mean, there are a lot of scientists.
It depends on the survey you look at, because they looked at different universes. There are some at respectable secular universities. Yes, sir.
Where do organizations like ISIT get their funding, and where does NCSE get its funding?
Yeah. So organizations like ISIT, Heartland, other climate change denial, they, for some reason, don't open up their books to us, but to the extent that you can tell from tax forms, some from industry, although Heartland, for example, lost a lot of industry sponsors over the Unabomber billboard in particular. Private foundations with either free market fundamentalist or religious fundamentalist bents, direct mail fundraising. They'll write studies for people and sometimes get paid for them. NCSE tends to run about half and half between private donations, often in the forms of $40 yearly memberships. Sign up at ncsc.com/join. And a half from private foundations, particularly ones concerned with civil liberties and science education, as you might expect. Yes, sir.
Just wondering how much time and energy you spend looking at reviewing state legislatures, material on that, which sort of helps or hinders what you're trying to accomplish?
Excellent question, and since I'm the one at the office who does it and don't get enough credit for it,
Here's your chance.
yeah. So pretty much in legislative session, I'm looking at the state legislatures every couple of days. It is now fairly easy to do so because there are a variety of third parties that go around and hoover up the contents of state legislatures' websites every day, and then you can search by keyword, and that's very handy. So, 15 minutes a day and I'm done. I'm looking for legislation that mentions evolution, climate change, global warming, next generation science standards, design theory, origin science, and a bunch of other recherche terms. I do pretty well. So during legislative session, as I say, so we're talking late winter, early spring, I'm doing this every couple of days. When legislatures are less, it's a,
you get a hit.
when I get a hit, I can't give away all my secrets, but I spring into action. I have been doing this for a long time. I guess I started NCSE in 1998. So I tend to recognize the bills and know where they come from and who the sponsor is. Often I know the person who actually wrote it and handed it to the sponsor. I know the history of what's been going on in that state. In some states there are good state organizations that will swing into action and I don't really have to do anything. For example, Oklahoma is marvelous, Florida is marvelous, Kansas is marvelous because they've had so much trouble, they know how to deal with things. I have other states where it's all brand new territory. And then I swing into action in different ways. There were 2 bills in New Hampshire in 2012, and no one knew what to do about that. Yes, ma'am.
Early on, you showed a slide that listed causes of human contributors to climate change. And there was one thing that I noticed was absent, which I have been of the impression is a significant contributor. And that is factory farming and the methane gases produced by animals that we farm for our own consumption. I'm wondering if that was left off because it really isn't all that important a contributor, or if it was left off because it's politically sensitive and people don't like to see on the list something that they could do to help correct the situation?
Well, I'm not trying to do a science talk, so I didn't really give a list of the contributors. And the only one I mentioned, because it's the major one, is the burning of fossil fuels. If I were giving a list, I probably would mention, I might mention factory farming. I'd mention actually cement and concrete production well above that, though, because that's actually much, pound for pound, that's a lot more serious.
In the statistics where the table that said hours taught, and you had a mean, a lot of cases of roughly 4,
Yeah.
and a median of about 1.2. And that suggests to me that there's a whole lot of teaching going on in a few classes. And when the median is that separated from the mean, that you've got outliers, a huge amount going on, and a lot with a little bit.
Well, I think it's the middle school teachers, your point, who are pulling the average down. I think in the high schools it came to about 4. Just for purposes of comparison, in the earlier study on evolution by the Penn State researchers, they found 13.7 hours were devoted to evolution in the average high school biology class, which is not nearly enough as it is, but okay.
You're very conscious to say you're talking about public schools. Obviously, the private schools, and then we have this thing called charter schools. Is that, how are we able to get into particularly charter schools? Because frequently they are funded with public funds.
And homeschools too, I might add.
Homeschools are the private.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's kind of a limit about how much influence NCSE or really anyone can have over private charter and homeschooling environments. Sometimes we can do something, especially when, for example, a charter school is teaching creationism. That's something that we can sometimes shut down. So NCSE's bread and butter used to be evolution and evolution alone. And there's a tool you can use for dealing with the teaching of evolution that you can't use for climate change, which is the First Amendment. Teaching creationism in public schools is a violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. There's abundant case law on this. We have other tools at our disposal when dealing with a situation like that, but we've always got that tool. When it comes to climate change, you know, there is no constitutional right not to be taught bogus science, alas. There is a possible argument that some state constitution guarantees of an adequate education might mean no bogus science. I do not believe this has been tried in a court yet, and I don't have high hopes for it.
This is one area where you're dealing with something that people can't go out and do something. Like, you can't drop a rock out of a window and see if it falls. But I think, to me, part of the exciting thing about this is just looking at how are people testing this hypothesis. And to me, that would be a way I would teach it in the schools. To say there's stuff we're doing in terms of taking temperatures all over the world. I saw an article about they have people going out and typing in temperature measurements that were taken off ships in the early 20th century. I mean, all this stuff sounds to me like if you pursue it that way, it would be sort of an exciting way to teach it.
Yeah, well, there are various kinds of demonstrations you can do to show the basic principles, including, for example, radiative forcing from greenhouse gases. You can do that in a class, in a lab. But there are, I mean, one of the there are teachers who make a very successful job of teaching climate change in the way you suggest, by, you know, reviewing the various sources of evidence and making it come alive for students. One thing we like to recommend is having a local connection. And how does climate change affect the community and the locality and the state in which the students live? And actually, one thing about the Smithsonian museums that I admire is that there is that local connection. Also, I was out today at the National Aquarium in Baltimore, and they have all those nice displays about the Chesapeake watershed and so forth. And making it relevant to students, in part by making it local, is a very good pedagogical technique.
Ultimately, the arguments seem to be at different levels. We're talking past each other. Scientists, people in this room, want data, want analysis. The people are, you past history with dealing with the evolution, are coming from a completely different mindset. And that how do we, until you get closer together, you can't really have a discussion to explain, to get them to think about things in their context.
So there are different ways to dealing with this, but let me reiterate one that I think is particularly important for climate change, and that is finding, as it were, ambassadors who bridge the communities. So again, take Catherine Hayhoe, who is a scientist at Texas Tech. Now, she's an evangelical Christian and has been a long time, and she's married to an evangelical Christian pastor, and she has evangelical Christian street cred. But she's a climate scientist, and she can talk about climate science and present it in a way that's respects the science, but also respects the religious sensibilities of that community in such a way that they understand this woman is one of us. She speaks our language. She accepts the science, and she's pretty convincing about it. Maybe we're wrong.
Are you a cloner?
Okay, so that's on the to-do list.